Subscribe.
I do get a kick out of fast RMX from time to time, but this adrenaline-pumping racer doesn't usually entice me to stick around for long periods of time. It is a well-made game, but whenever I try it again, I run into the same problems over and over. That's not to say fast RMX is a bad game. I still have fun with it every now and then, but it doesn't scratch that racing itch as much as a good kart racer does for me. Fast RMX is a great looking game. All the cars look pretty cool, and so do the tracks. In spite of how fast everything moves, it still runs very smoothly. The soundtrack is pretty good too, with a lot of breakbeats and high energy electronic music. In terms of the gameplay, I like the different approach to racing. The game is much more focused on intense high speed than most others that opt for tight controls or wacky items. I've heard some comparisons to the F-Zero franchise. Personally, I've never played an F-Zero game, but they do look pretty similar. If there was a new F-Zero that played like this, I don't think I'd mind it. While Fast RMX has a good concept and indeed a lot of fun moments, the thing that always draws me out is the controls. They're not like any other racer I've played. This isn't a bad thing in itself, but because of that I end up feeling lost every time I play. Whenever I think I'm getting the hang of it, I try a new course and everything before feels like a fluke. I never felt like the controls were properly introduced to me or explained. I looked them up so I know what all the buttons do, but the missing piece is when I should be using them. It's kind of like when people play Mario Kart and they don't know when to drift. Most people figure out when to drift in Mario Kart after a while, possibly from another person, if not by themselves. The problem with Fast RMX is twofold. There isn't a lot of people I know to play this with. Out of those who'd be down to play, all of them are in a similar place to me. Second, every race is so fast that trying to figure out the controls in the middle of everything is overwhelming. As much as people hate them, I really do think an in-depth tutorial or explanation would have been the best way to get people started with Fast RMX. I can still have fun with Fast RMX if I really try. The super high speed action is entertaining no matter what your skill level is. But whenever I pick this game up, I get to that point where my guesswork with the controls is not enough. At that point, I almost always put it back down until I need a break from Mario Kart again.
6 out of 10!
Kirby Star Allies could have been cool. There was an interesting premise here with bringing in all these characters from the series' history and making them playable, but in the end it didn't do enough to sway me from my usual feelings towards Kirby. Kirby's gameplay works for sure. I can see why people like it, but Star Allies was somehow the most difficult to like so far. I can't quite place my finger on it, but there was something that kept me from having a good time. The main gameplay loop didn't really help. Slow 2D platforming, copying enemies, I've seen it all before. One thing I realized while playing Star Allies was how overpowered Kirby is, and how that made the game less interesting. Most of the journey is just pummeling bad guys until you reach the end, which is made even worse when you're playing with other people. I know that Kirby is meant to be an easier series, but Star Allies didn't really do anything else to keep me interested. The idea of playing as all these new characters was nice, but after I tried all their moves, the novelty went away and it became the same slog it was with Kirby. The visuals were fine, but Kirby is such a simple character in such a simple world that any graphical upgrade the Switch could provide wouldn't really do much to enhance the experience. It's simple shapes and bright colors. You can add some more textures and whatnot, but Kirby's visual design doesn't lend itself to innovation as much as some other series. The music is Kirby music. I don't know if I mentioned this before, but I don't really have that much of a connection to Kirby music. I always thought it was fine, but it never really felt tonally accurate to me. The notable tracks are all loud and triumphant, but it doesn't match the stroll of a video game Kirby usually is. Even before the end of the first world, I was getting burnt out. Pretty early on, I was looking up how much time I'd be spending on it before it's over. Only 4 worlds, but they are decently sized. I opted to gun it for the ending so I could get a move on with my life. And I thought the ending was pretty cool, but it was too little too late. Kirby Star Allies is just there. Its only appeal is that it's the latest 2D Kirby game. Other than that, it's just meh.
5 out of 10!
I owe a lot to Metroid, and in particular Metroid Dread. I was one of those guys who knew a lot about Metroid as a series, things like the impact it had on the game industry and game design, and a good amount of development stories as well. I found that stuff interesting, but I never really got into proper 2D Metroid. Flashback to 2021 when Metroid Dread was announced, a new fully fledged 2D Metroid continuing the storyline and taking the moniker of the long-thought-dead project from the 2000s. This was a huge deal, so I got to work. I made it my mission to play each 2D Metroid game, 1 to 4 to prepare myself. Along the journey, more footage would be released. Eventually the game released and I had to completely avoid the internet until I finished Fusion. I honestly began to worry. I fell into the hype trap. The reception seemed good, but was I going to like it? Truth be told, I had no idea. That is, until I booted it up myself. After the prologue, the first thing you see is an animated cutscene introducing me to ZDR and our newfound objective. First thing I notice is how well animated it is. It's amazing to me how the developers were able to make characters expressive even when everyone's wearing suits and helmets. The second, this game actually looks pretty good. I wasn't super sold by the graphics while watching the trailers, but seeing it in action on my TV, it works pretty well. Metroid Dread's main color would have to be gray, but in gameplay I found it really sold attention. Samus sticks out starkly against the backgrounds, which is good for gameplay as well as showcasing how unwelcome she is. Moving past the artsy stuff, how does Dread play? Smooth as butter. This is the best Samus has ever controlled. Ever. She's fast, her actions are also snappy, and she has the new slide move, which seems like a no-brainer these days, but it allows Samus to traverse much more smoothly than before. All of this is tied together by the incredible animation work. The buttons are responsive, but the animations seamlessly blend actions together, making it feel like you're parkouring your way around the planet. The map design is my exact sweet spot for a Metroidvania. ZDR is not a linear space, but the way you progress from main objective to main objective will have you conveniently zipping around in a pretty linear fashion. However, as much as the game guides you through ZDR, at almost any point you can turn around and pick another path, and you'll often be rewarded with new information, bonus pickups, or even a sequence break. I really enjoy the story in Metroid Dread. Yes, there is an actual story, and it doesn't feel shoehorned in or take away from the gameplay. In the past, I didn't really care much for Metroid stories, but Dread's mission is personal to Samus, and we get to see some more of her history along with some actual character expression like I mentioned before. She is still first and foremost a stoic armored warrior, but at points we see her get confused, frustrated, nervous, and more. It's like there's a real person inside that suit now, and it brings a new purpose to proceed through Dread. There is so much more I could talk about with Metroid Dread. It really felt like it hit top marks on all levels. The immersive environments, the combat, the puzzles, I even like the music for what it's worth. Dread gave me the opportunity to explore an amazing franchise, ending with one of my favorite 2D games to date. The first thing I did after beating Metroid Dread was beat it again, and then again, and again until I got all the extras. Then one more time for good measure. If you want a marker for what I want in a Metroidvania experience, or hell, even just a gaming experience in general, this is your reference point.
Oh my god, it's a 10 out of 10!
The Pokemon Let's Go games were a rather strange entry in the series. It was pretty obvious from the get-go that these games were meant to entice the huge new player base that Pokemon Go brought in. It tried to change up the mechanics to make itself more like Pokemon Go while trying to keep the feel of a mainline Pokemon game. Overall, it felt like some kind of mashup of the two. Let's start with the more traditional aspects of Let's Go. Pokemon Let's Go Pikachu, in my case, was a remake of Gen 1. In fact, if you don't count the Kanto region in Heart Gold, this is the only version of Gen 1 I've played. On this front, it feels like any other Pokemon game to me. Traveling the region, beating gyms, bumping into your rival, beating the Elite Four, the whole thing. I guess this is where the formula started, so I can't be too negative, but in retrospect, it's interesting to see just how little the sequels actually change things up on that front. I didn't find Gen 1 to be all that special overall, it was just fine. What threw me for a loop was the new Pokemon Go-esque features, which I felt threw the balance all out of whack. Catching Pokemon in Pokemon Go is just fine. It's something to do with your thumbs while you're out and about, but putting it in a setting like this makes Let's Go feel lesser than a home console Pokemon game should be. Catching Pokemon is incredibly easy. It's the same as Pokemon Go, except you don't even have to aim anymore. The motion controls are very generous in their aim, so it's really only about timing. My main issue with the new approach to the wild Pokemon is that it takes out a pretty vital part of the progression. Like it or not, wild Pokemon are really important to the game. They serve as a testbed for training your team, not just gaining XP, but learning their moves and type advantages and setups even. The new system also makes Pokemon feel more like a collectible than an actual creature. There's no reason not to catch a wild Pokemon in this game, since there's no battle and catching is the only way to get XP, whereas before catching a Pokemon was a decision, whether that be to add them to your team or keep them as a backup or add them to your Pokedex. In this new system, trainer and gym battles feel a little out of place. They don't change from the usual experience, but now you have players who had less time to prepare, so the fix seemed to be to make the battles really easy. I'd bring up the EXP share again, but honestly my my bigger problem is how the fights scale. If you play like I do and intentionally fight all the trainers, then by the end of the game your team will be so massively overpowered the Elite Four will be a joke. I think the game just gives out too much experience sometimes, as if it expects you to avoid fights as much as possible. Everything else about Pokemon Go is just, again, another Pokemon game. It looks prettier and sounds nicer finally being off the pure handhelds, but the main experience is just Pokemon again. I didn't really like the changes they made to catching Pokemon, but the game was so easy that I breezed through it in no time. So I can say that Let's Go probably won't stress you out. Honestly, sometimes that's a good thing. I don't think it's worth full price, and it certainly doesn't compete with the best of the series, but if you do play it, I don't think you'll hate it.
6 out of 10!
Puyo Puyo Tetris is a pretty simple game. You just combine the two classic puzzle games and boom, there you go. Because Puyo Puyo and Tetris are pretty fun puzzle games on their own, this combination title ups the fun and ends up being one of my favorite puzzle games out there. The best part of Puyo Puyo Tetris is all of the different modes there are to choose from. Of course, you can play the two games individually whenever you like, and they're just as good as ever. What's even better is the modes that combine both games, whether that be managing both on one board, or swapping between both on a timer, or fulfilling challenges on either side. When I played, I would 9 times out of 10 play swap mode, where you start off playing one game and then switch to the other on a timer. Then you keep going back and forth trying to manage both games at the same time. This is my favorite because it involved Puyo Puyo and Tetris, but didn't try to mash them together onto one board, which usually felt awkward to play. Those modes can work, but I feel like they don't let you see the full potential of either. Puyo Puyo Tetris is one of those few games that anyone can sit down and play. Both Puyo Puyo and Tetris are incredibly simple concepts for puzzle games. Pretty much everyone knows how to play Tetris, and while not as many people know Puyo Puyo, it's almost just as simple. Of course, you can get complicated if you want, going for crazy combos and T-spins, but you don't need to get that deep to enjoy what this game has to offer. Because of its accessibility, I'd play this a lot with family. It was a really fun multiplayer environment to be in, as there's some natural competition trying to outscore and mess with each other, but most modes have enough of that chaos to keep people from getting too into it and ruining it for everyone else. And honestly, as far as I'm concerned, that's pretty much it. Puyo Puyo Tetris has a lot of other content, including its own adventure mode, but even without that, I think the game is fun enough to recommend. Tetris and Puyo Puyo are proven puzzle games. They're engaging and always challenging you. Put them together and you get a really fun party game. Not all the modes work for me, but the ones that do, I could play for hours on end without getting bored. Puyo Puyo Tetris might be hard to break out at a party because it doesn't seem as exciting as an action game or as proven as something like Mario Party, but I've never had a bad time playing this with people. When it comes to a game like this, that's really all I could ask for.
8 out of 10!
Super Mario Odyssey proves that Mario has still got tricks up his sleeve even after decades of top-notch titles. This game is both a leap forward and a return to form, a unique twist and a nostalgic callback. It has so much to do that you could play it for hours and hours on end. The structure of Odyssey harkens back to the early 3D days, opting for an open approach to the levels. Like 64, each level is a sandbox where the player can discover any collectible in almost any order. Odyssey takes this into the new age by expanding on that idea greatly. There are way more moons to discover at each level than there were power stars. Almost every nook and cranny will have a power moon in it. The levels are a lot bigger than before, but because there's so many more collectibles to find, it feels justified. Within these levels are a ton of different gameplay gimmicks and tools to play around with. Mario's movement has never felt this good. He's got all of his old moves from previous 3D games, minus the galaxy spin, but that's to be expected. Along with that are a ton of new options that allow Mario to cross crazy gaps and scale almost any obstacle. Then, of course, the capture mechanic comes in as the cherry on top. As if Mario didn't have enough moves, every enemy in the game also becomes a power-up, allowing for an unfathomable amount of gameplay opportunities. Mario Odyssey really gives the player the most freedom and options of control of any 3D Mario to date, and it's why Odyssey is fun to play even regardless of the mission. Now let's talk about those power moons. There are a lot of them, and I mean a lot. This is my only real problem with Odyssey, is that it feels kind of bloated. I mentioned earlier that pretty much every corner of each level has a moon to discover, but a lot of those moons don't feel very rewarding. I'm talking ones that just require you to solve a basic platform challenge or stomp on the ground, or those that are just standing there waiting to be collected. On the other hand, some moons are really cryptic, like some of the ones that use photo references or really tight timing or obscure uses of the capture mechanic. Having a variety of skill levels covered with easier and harder moons is nice, but I do feel that cramming so many of them into a level diminishes the reward a bit. No matter what challenge you complete, you'll always be getting a moon. I would have been okay with lowering the total a bit if it meant the developers were more selective with their challenges, or even another collectible to better match the type of challenge you'd be completing. Sometimes they do that with the bundle of moons, but that's more for bosses and story stuff, not the harder missions per se. But other than that, Mario Odyssey is an amazing experience. It's one of the best looking Mario games, both in its graphics and its crazy art direction. Its soundtrack is amazing, honestly too good. It's even got a slightly more in-depth story, which is cool to see. But most of all, Odyssey is just fun to play. Seriously, jumping around doing parkour moves, hopping from enemy to enemy around the open levels is fun enough. If you have a Switch, Mario Odyssey is a must.
9 out of 10!
Mario Party isn't a series I'm all that familiar with. Never really played them growing up or anything. I knew of them, but that was about it. If you know me personally, you may think that's because I hate Mario Party, but that's not exactly true. I just think it's really boring. The only part of Mario Party I generally like is the minigames. The whole rolling dice, hunting down stars is just not very engaging to me. So then why did I even get Super Mario Party? Well, we needed a party game that wasn't Smash or Mario Kart on the Switch. I had no idea until after playing it and looking up videos that Super Mario Party had the reception it did. Nowadays, I hear mixed things on Super Mario Party, but when it first came out, it was heralded as a return to form. After years of messing around with the board, the developers finally gave up and just gave everyone the experience that people knew from the good old days. Again, whenever I did play Mario Party, the board was always my least favorite part of the experience. I can't say whether or not the car or on-foot approach is better. I never played them, and if I did, I probably wouldn't like either anyway. It can be fun to emulate a board game experience on the TV. It's cool how some maps can change their layouts in the middle of a game. It creates some wacky moments, but I just find the pace too slow for my liking. For me, the minigames are where it's at. Every turn in Mario Party is just a way to get to whatever minigame is next. Super Mario Party's minigames I found to be pretty fun on average. There's not any that really stood out to me, but there also weren't any that I hated. I do really like that you can practice the game right away in the ready menu. Now there's no wait time to start a practice round, and I think people get the rules a lot faster now. I think Super Mario Party is a fine game. It's not my first choice for a party experience, but if people want to play it, I won't complain much more than I usually do. The minigames are fun, the boards are whatever. It sounds good and looks pretty good, although I'm not a fan of the bare, clean lines and text. It makes an already boring game feel even more so. Also, I think the character roster isn't great. It's got all the big names, but it's pretty small and has some weird choices in there too. Last complaint, I promise. Mario Party ain't my thing, but Super Mario Party on the Switch is fine for what it is.
6 out of 10!
Smash Ultimate is probably the hardest game I will ever have to write a review on. My feelings on the game change all the time. One day you can find me loving or hating this game depending on what I had for breakfast that morning. Starting with the positives, Ultimate feels like an achievement of a game. I vividly remember the Everyone is Here trailer, bringing back literally every character to ever be playable in Smash Bros. All characters will be brought to the Switch with updated looks and mechanics. Plenty of characters would receive a complete overhaul. Having so many characters not just playable, but voice acted, incredibly well animated, kits thought out and balanced. It's a game dev achievement that I still can't entirely wrap my head around. And as we would find out, they'd still be adding more newcomers than any previous game. This mentality of bringing in all aspects of Smash, being the ultimate Smash game, is not just limited to the characters. Along with them comes the most stages of any Smash game, most of which look fantastic and are still a blast to play on. Ultimate also has the most music of any Smash game, music from all corners of the industry. And while some people like to make fun of the fact that some songs don't fit the gameplay, I'm glad that not all songs are battle music. Sometimes you just need a goofy song or a more atmospheric piece or just a classic untouched tune. I'm glad to see another attempt at a story mode, as I feel Smash has so much potential for it. But in the end, World of Light was a disappointment. I wanted an actual story mode with cutscenes where characters actually interact with each other, where you make your way through classic game settings taking down minions along the way. What I got instead was the event mode with a map and a story that can fit on a post-it note. Other single player content was alright. Classic mode was the most fun by far. Everything else was fine. I was just disappointed that All-Star mode got downgraded to a Mob Smash event. So Smash Ultimate sounds pretty good so far, right? I think so, but all of this stuff I mentioned doesn't have anything to do with how Ultimate actually plays. That's where my real problems step in. Keep in mind, my favorite way to play Smash is 1v1 competitive rules. I still enjoy playing party mode from time to time, but the depth that comes from competitive Smash is what I find most interesting. As it stands, playing Ultimate even a little competitively competitively makes me want to gouge my eyes out. There's way too many matchups to remember, the buffer system makes movement and defensive play really awkward. This encourages players even at my level to prefer not to engage in a fight in order to avoid jank. I get it, it makes sense, and I do it too sometimes, but I never get any enjoyment out of playing this way. In a weird way, this also affects casual play. Because the mechanics feel so awkward, casual matches become a game of who can throw the most items, and when one person gets a good item, it usually snowballs the whole match. So I have mixed feelings on Smash Ultimate. I want to like this game so bad because of how much variety it brings, and frankly just how much of a landmark game it has become. But actually playing with other people is torture. I'd rather play against bots because they're not programmed to know the meta. Take this score with a grain of salt. Ultimate has stopped getting updates and its meta has started to settle, but my feelings still change day to day. Depending on when you ask me, this could be a 9 or it could be a 4. Right now, let's go with
7 out of 10!
Team Sonic Racing is one of those games that is fun at its core, but is surrounded by so much boring or bad stuff that it's hard to recommend. The Switch version in particular is difficult to recommend because while this version is probably going to reach the most people, it doesn't feel like it was made for it either. Team Sonic Racing looks both good and bad in different areas. On the Switch, the characters look like plastic toys, and the lighting in some areas is ugly, and some things take an awkwardly long time to load. However, I think the tracks look pretty good on average, as long as there's not too many water effects. I can't really say the same for the music. The soundtrack does not hit my ears very well. I think it's because there's a lot of similar instruments used between this game and Sonic Forces, a game that I said had a horrible soundtrack. Not all the songs suck though. There are some real good tracks in there, particularly the ones that forego the mid-range synths in favor of electric guitars. That's enough about Team Sonic Racing's aesthetics. How about the actual game? I'd say it's just as inconsistent. The tracks are the first problem I have with it. Playing this game, I felt ripped off by how many tracks were reused with no updates or adjustments to the new mechanics. They didn't even bother to label them as retro tracks. They just put them in with the rest and hoped no one would notice. There's also a pretty bad story mode in here. All it is listening to a table read of the script accompanied by some portraits and text, then followed up by missions. The story felt like a first draft. It wasn't very interesting and certainly didn't justify the repetitive missions. The best thing about Team Sonic Racing is definitely the actual driving. It uses the same engine as Sonic and All-Stars Racing Transformed, which is one of my favorite racing engines to play on. General controls feel nice and responsive, the item play is fine but not great, throwing items is a little jank, but items are generally more understated than other kart racers, so it's not a big deal. Especially now with the team mechanic, which I think is the coolest new thing in the game. So Team Sonic Racing is a mixed bag for me. For every positive there is a negative, but because it takes its core from the racing game I really like, I still find it a little fun. I don't think it's worth buying right now, especially if it's at full price, but if you do find yourself faced with a copy, then it won't be the worst thing in the world.
6 out of 10!
When Breath of the Wild came out, it seemed almost too good to be true. So many outlets giving 10 after 10 after 10, calling it a masterpiece, a genre-defining title, the best game in a generation. I got Breath of the Wild myself maybe about a year after its release, when things had died down a little bit, but still so much praise. You've got to play it, it's so good, one of the best games ever made. If you're watching this around the release of this video, you can go see IGN's top 100 games list, and The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild will be right at the tippy top. So going into Breath of the Wild for the first time, I felt a bit intimidated. I got past the tutorial and out to Kakariko and had a really good time. But after that, I put the game down. I knew after that I'd have to go out and explore on my own. There's this sense of doom I got with Breath of the Wild at that point, because I knew how big this game was. I liked what I played so far, but with how many hours it takes to beat this game on average, I was bound to find something I didn't like. I didn't want to be disappointed, so I stopped. It wasn't until a couple years later I decided to play it again. I had let go of the notion that I had to play it for its significance, and told myself that if I didn't like it, I had the right to stop. That's when Breath of the Wild became really fun. I was so immersed that I spent way longer on it than I had thought. This version of Hyrule is vast, and I did find that intimidating at first. There's a lot to take in here. But what helped was realizing I didn't need to stop every 5 minutes to do something. Breath of the Wild allows you plenty of room to skip stuff if you want. Most of my time was spent hunting shrines, but other players might do a lot less and get away just fine. The coolest part of Breath of the Wild's design to me is that it's focused on making the player feel comfortable. From the very beginning, you're told to forge your own path. You're shown where Ganon is early on, so it's up to the player to decide when they're ready to go there. Of course, you're encouraged to do some preparation, but it's all a suggestion. This just leaves you out in Hyrule to do whatever you want, and that's a very cool feeling. Every choice you make in Breath of the Wild is your own. Nothing is required of you besides beating Ganon, and that context is very empowering. After Kakariko, I decided to just run around a little. I took down some camps, found some shrines, got a horse, and then I was really off. I found a coliseum and got my ass beat by some lion centaur things and said, alright, let's not do that again. I went all the way across the map to Vamado for my first divine beast. After that, some more shrines and quests, and I could tell I had really improved as a player. I went back to find those lion things and beat one for the first time and felt really accomplished. See all that stuff I just talked about? Completely unnecessary. But it was my choice, and so it felt just as good, if not better, than checking a quest off a list. That's what makes Breath of the Wild so special. Now, Breath of the Wild isn't the only game to do this, but it is one of the best at it. For me, as soon as I let go of those expectations that came along with this game, that's when Breath of the Wild actually became as good as people say. Do people overhype this game still? Yeah, I think so. But even still, there is some truth to what people say, and it will remain one of my favorite games for a while to come.
Oh my god, it's a 10 out of 10!
Merry Christmas.